What's good, assholes? Today, I'm going to be reviewing the Ibis HD6. I'm out here in Hidalgo, Mexico, just 2 hours outside of Mexico City. I've been riding this bike thanks to Rental Ibis Hidalgo at the KRB Bike Park, which has an excellent selection of shuttle access downhill trails that I think are a great testing ground for a bike of this stature. And this bike is interesting because if you know anything about me or my preferences, I would say this bike doesn't quite align with those. And I honestly had pretty low expectations coming into this week of riding. I was like, oh, even if the bike isn't that good for me, I'll still be able to have a great time. But after doing my best to put it through its paces out here, I can definitely say I was pleasantly surprised. And I like this bike way, way more than I expected. And I guess in this video, I'm gonna try and understand why. So let's get into it. So I think the only place to start with this bike is the geometry. And Ibis is absolutely an outlier in how they do their sizing. This is a size large, which puts the reach at 508 mils and the chainstay at 435, which on paper is, yeah, everything I dislike about modern mountain bike geometry. I've been a proponent of longer chainstays, more balanced front to rear ratios, weighting the front end, with the weight you plant in your legs and your feet. But this bike worked surprisingly well, but in a completely different style, a completely different manner than what I was used to. So instead of weighting the front wheel with the weight I hold in my legs, through the cranks, this bike generated front wheel grip by putting me in such an aggressive position over the front that I was just planting the front wheel with like my arms and my body weight. And I think what kind of makes this package work is that the reach is so long. I feel like bikes with short chainstays and maybe moderate reaches, like your neutral riding position is still kind of neutral or rearward, and the front wheel's light because it's still like scary to get over the front and you have to actively pull yourself into this aggressive position. So that's where I feel like there's a major disconnect in how to weight the front wheel, and it's tough to do consistently. With this bike, the reach is so long that you're just in this over the front position by default, and the stack is pretty low. The head angle isn't super slack. So it just felt like I was riding almost like a unicycle on the front wheel, and the back wheel was just there following me and the front wheel around. And I've never felt that plantedness on the front wheel like that with my upper body weight, maybe besides the Geometron. And that was something that was brought up in the Geometron a lot because I talked about front to rear center ratios, and that bike had like a 520 mil reach and a 460 mil chainstay. But if we go back to the front and rear center ratio, it's still like more rearward biased, based on that number. But that's where I feel like the front to rear center ratio thing, it's super relevant. It's a number that I think represents a feeling of balance, but it's not the entire picture. And with this bike, I feel like it reaches maybe an inflection point where if you're not gonna build a bike that is built around generating front wheel grip through the chassis and with the weight you put through the cranks, I feel like you almost have to give the rider more wheelbase and a reach that just plants you over the front. And that comes with drawbacks, which I'll get into later, but at least that gives you a solid base and a neutral riding position that generates front wheel grip. And then also it just gives you a little bit more wheelbase. I mean, for a bike with a 508 mil reach, the wheelbase is still stupid short. It's like 1285. And usually I'm riding bikes that have even a 475 mil reach that have wheelbases longer than that. So even though this bike is unbalanced in a sense that I've talked about a lot, it kind of works because of the wheelbase and being in this aggressive position over the front. I still did have some front scary moments. It was something that I was having to be slightly aware of, but it didn't punish me nearly as bad as I thought coming into riding this bike. And by the end of my days here, like, I felt pretty ingrained in the handling characteristic and I was able to push the bike pretty hard. However, I think the compromise with this geometry concept is that since you are so over the front, it's pretty manageable on flatter, more meandering trails. But as soon as you get into really steep, aggressive terrain, it's just kind of scary to hold that position. You're quite a bit more exposed and you are really loading the front under compressions. And I definitely got sensations where I was getting bucked forward and forward, and I felt like it was much harder to stay in a planted, stable position. And multiple times I had my feet get blown off the pedal forward because I feel like it was really hard to stay planted and rearward and drop my heels. That also made me struggle really planting the bike under braking. Again, I just felt like my entire body weight was over the front, so it was really hard to get the rear to dig in effectively and slow down. So for multiple reasons, it just was not nearly as confidence inspiring as bikes that allow you to have front end grip from a more neutral riding position with, you know, longer chainstay, higher stack. It's like a completely different concept. But on like flatter and more, you know, mundane trails, it absolutely worked. Another downside of being in this super aggressive over the front wheel position is I actually found it was somewhat hard to pop the bike, especially if the trail was already going downhill. It was really hard to get behind the rear wheel and get far enough back to leverage the front wheel up. And this is something that the short chainstayers, this is the main point, is that it's easy to bunny hop. And kind of in a sense it was. It got up quicker in some situations, but it was still challenging in a sense to overcome that low front end being over the front when you needed to pop up quickly on the rear wheel. And it felt like I was doing a lot of like pull up style hops where I wasn't actually getting a bunny hop, but I was just like pulling up and bouncing the bike. And I think that is absolutely worth considering. And this has been a critique of the short chainstay theory a little bit, is like the bike did flick around a bit in a short chainstay manner a little bit, but then again, you're also dealing with a long wheelbase because of the size, but I feel like you need that reach and long wheelbase to plant on the front, but then you also lose a little bit of that poppy playfulness that you want out of a short chainstay bike. So that's where I feel like it's almost adjacent to a longer chainstay bike. You're just running into the same issue in a bit of a different way. This is all about just weight bias and balance and leverage. And I feel like to get a short chainstay concept to work, to be in the middle of these wheels with a super long reach, you end up still running into a leverage issue over the rear wheel because you need to be so over the front with your body weight. And again, that's where I think the longer chainstay concept, if you run high bars and a longer rear end, you can kind of find a balance there that accomplishes everything in a single package. And combined with being more stretched out on the bike, I feel like it is a bit harder to be articulate with your riding and maneuver the bike in a playful sense. Being that it put me so far over the front and the reach was so long, my neutral riding position was way more extended, and I didn't have as much arm travel to suck the bike up or maneuver and place the bike, but it didn't hold me back nearly as much as I thought. It was just a bit more of a static riding position. Like the thing I was having to manage on this bike wasn't so much front end grip, it was more of like getting bucked forward a bit much and being in a bit of an exposed position. So if I could handle that, I could kind of let the bike plant on the front and commit to the corners. So it wasn't the thing I was expecting to have to manage on this bike. I expected to be searching for front end grip, but I actually had quite a bit of it. It was just dealing with the downsides of the geometry in other situations. Another thing that I think also helped out this bike in the grip and feel I was able to achieve was the frame flex. This is a bike that is quite similar to pivots, and I've struggled a bit on pivots in the past, but I think a pretty significant distinction between this bike and pivots is I feel like this is a way flexier bike on the front triangle and the rear triangle. And I think if the frame was way stiffer, the front end grip issue would have been compounded drastically. And I think that's what hurts pivots with a bit of a similar geometry concept as this. But with this bike, I feel like it wasn't deflecting as much from a frame flex perspective. And that just meant I felt like I was punished less for dicey front end situations, and even the rear too. I feel like it was tracking fairly well. It wasn't as muted or as dead in a confidence inspiring way as some aluminum bikes I've ridden recently. It's a bit more springy and like almost undamped, but it was compliant in a way that didn't make me feel like I was getting punished for getting deflected or losing traction earlier than I expected. It just wasn't surprising me in ways from like a frame flex perspective that it would deflect unpredictably. And on the other end, I didn't feel like there's not a ton of berms or like huge compressions here, but I felt like it was like quite rideable to a high level, and it wasn't preventing me from like pushing the bike super hard in situations where, you know, frame flex might be a bit uncomfortable. So I think this bike strikes a quite good balance between stiffness and rigidity. And I think maybe it being on the slightly more compliant side definitely helps with its rideability in this geometry concept. The suspension as a whole, I think works really well. I set sag and completely forgot it. I played around with the fork a little bit. I think this bike was a little stink bug, was another thing helping to plant the front and I think ride the bike in the way it wanted to be ridden, which is hella over the front. So that's where I biased my suspension setup, but I mean, I hardly did any clickers. It just seemed to work fairly well for most things. It wasn't the most settled. The personality of the entire bike for a enduro bike of this stature feels definitely more trail bikey. It's absolutely really efficient under the pedals. The bike responds quickly. It's incredibly efficient. It pumps well. I do think I was getting somewhat significant amount of feedback through my feet, and I think that with the riding position it put me in, definitely like kicked my feet off the pedals a few times. So not the most planted and confidence inspiring from that sense, but as a package, again, I think it worked pretty well. It's just not going to be the most confidence inspiring bike in the steepest, most aggressive terrain, especially if there's lots of bumps in the steeps. I think that's where the bike kind of gets the most out of sort. Also, if you're not wanting to be over the front, it's not going to work for you. I was able to adapt to that riding style way better than I ever expected, but it needs you to be in that position for this bike to work. This is the bike that I had the lowest expectations for coming into riding it, and the one that probably surprised me the most. Honestly, it's kind of annoying how well I got along with this bike because, again, it goes against everything I've kind of preached and learned about, you know, since I've started reviewing bikes on this channel. But I'm here to ride bikes with an open mind, and I'm gonna be honest with you guys, whether I like something or I don't, if it works or if it doesn't, even if it kind of goes against my previous experiences. I've been honest with everything up until this point, and I'm gonna continue to do so. I feel like this bike is kind of making me look like a bit of a hypocrite. You know, I'm trying to understand why, and I hope this video, you know, at least attempted to do that. But this is my honest experience with the bike. And I think it is a thing where it, you know, the long reach, short chainstay thing is kind of bad until you maybe take it to an extreme. For example, I feel like if I rode the extra medium, which traditionally would be in a much more appropriate reach range for me in my experience, I feel like I would have had a worse time on the extra medium. I think for this concept to work, you need the wheelbase and the reach to put you over the front and pretty much ride the bike on the front wheel. And that comes with downsides, but it is a viable option. I just think it maybe doesn't cover the widest setup range. Maybe that's where I still think the longer chainstay model is more robust, is I feel like you can get that front end grip, but it doesn't force you into as exposed of a position. The setup was way more robust on this than I expected. I think mainly because of the wheelbase maybe, but that's where I think the validity of both the concepts are. It's just they work in completely different styles. And I think understanding that still adds value. And I think, yeah, learning about that, riding this bike here in Mexico, was interesting and I think valuable to, you know, learning about bikes. So that's my experience. If you're interested in renting one of these bad boys down here in Mexico, hit up Rental Ibis Hidalgo and the KRB Bike Park to ride some sick trails. Hit me up on Patreon if you want to see more content. I post reviews over there early, do exclusive Q&As, and answer personal bike setup questions. So that's a great way to get involved and support the channel if you're looking to do that. But otherwise, thanks for